The cafe buzzed with the low hum of conversation, and the smell of roasted coffee beans. Sunlight poured through the glass windows, painting soft gold over the marble tables. At the corner sat Ethan Cole, a man whose suit screamed success and whose smirk announced arrogance. He liked this cafe because it was quiet, refined, and filled with people who recognized him, or at least pretended to. At the counter stood a young woman named Mia, her apron slightly stained from the morning rush she worked. Long hours, always smiling. Even when exhaustion tugged at her eyes that day, as she delivered a fresh cup to Ethan's table, she accidentally spilled a drop near his sleeve. He looked down, sharply glaring at her. "You should be more careful," she apologized. "Quickly, I'm so sorry, sir," he sighed, shaking his head. "Do you even know how much this suit costs?" she replied softly. "No, sir." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "You could never afford it anyway." The words hit her like a slap, but she didn't react. She simply nodded quietly and walked back to the counter, pretending his insult hadn't sunk deep inside her. But it had customers at nearby tables, looked away awkwardly, pretending not to hear. Ethan returned to his phone, smirking like he'd proven. Something Mia kept working, her mind racing between anger and restraint as she watched him order more expensive items with the same careless arrogance. Half an hour later, when the waiter brought him the check, Ethan waved lazily. "Put it on my tab." But the manager approached apologetically. "Sorry, sir, we no longer run tabs here. You'll need to settle now." Ethan frowned, annoyed. "I didn't bring my wallet. Have them hold it. I'll come back tomorrow." Mia overheard everything. Her hands froze around. A tray then, slowly she reached into her pocket, took out her worn wallet and walked straight to the counter. The entire cafe went quiet as she handed her card to the cashier. Her voice calm but steady. "I'll pay for his bill." Everyone stared. Ethan looked up, startled. "What are you doing?" She met his eyes for the first time today. "You're right, sir, I could never afford your suit, but I can afford your coffee." The card beeped, payment accepted. She turned without another word, untying her apron as she walked out the door, leaving silence and shame hanging in her wake. For a few seconds, Ethan didn't move, his hand still resting on the untouched bill. The cafe had fallen silent, the other customers whispering quietly behind their cups. It wasn't the money that stung him. It was the tone in her voice, calm, certain, dignified. He had insulted hundreds of people before, and none of them had ever dared look back at him. But the waitress hadn't even raised her voice. She had just left, and somehow that silence felt louder than any argument. When he finally stood, the manager cleared his throat softly. "Sir, she already paid for everything." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Keep the change," he muttered, though there was nothing left to pay. He walked outside, scanning the street, but Mia was already gone. Her small figure disappearing into the sunlight. He stood there for a long time, his reflection staring back at him from the glass window of the cafe, his own arrogance looking suddenly smaller. That night, he couldn't sleep, her words replaying in his head over and over. "You're right, sir, I could never afford your suit, but I can afford your coffee." He tried to laugh it off, but couldn't. Something about it didn't feel like defiance. It felt like truth. The next morning, instead of heading to his office, he found himself walking back to the same cafe. He wasn't sure why. Maybe guilt, maybe curiosity. When he entered, the same manager looked up, surprised. "Morning, sir. Are you looking for someone?" Ethan nodded. "The waitress from yesterday, Mia, is she here?" The manager frowned. "She quit after her shift last night." He blinked. "Quit? Why?" The manager shrugged. "Said she found a better opportunity. Somewhere else." Ethan stepped back slowly, his mind racing. What kind of opportunity could someone like her get overnight? Maybe she just wanted to escape his arrogance. Maybe he was the reason she left. The thought hit him harder than he expected. He walked to the counter and set down his card. "Pay for every employee's lunch today," he said quietly. The manager hesitated. "Are you sure?" Sir Ethan nodded. "I'm sure. And if Mia ever comes back, tell her the man who thought he could afford everything learned he couldn't afford his own pride that afternoon." As he sat in his office, he opened his email out of habit and froze. The top message was from a new client, a small catering company named Mia's Table, requesting a business partnership proposal. He stared at the screen, the corners of his lips lifting. In disbelief, Ethan read the email twice, his heart pounding every line, written with precision and quiet confidence. She wasn't asking for help. She was offering a partnership. Her proposal was simple. Her new company specialized in catering for corporate events, high quality, low cost. Her tone was professional, but one sentence stood out. Sometimes respect is the finest thing you can serve. He leaned back in his chair, staring at those words, unable to decide if it was coincidence or a message meant just for him. The next morning he called the number listed in the email. A familiar voice answered, calm and collected. "Good morning, Mia's Table. How can I help you?" His chest tightened slightly. "Hi, this is Ethan Cole from Apex Holdings. I received your proposal." There was a pause. Then her polite voice replied, "Of course, Mr. Cole, thank you for reading it. Would you like to schedule a meeting?" He hesitated for a moment. "Yes, tomorrow noon at my office, if that works for you." She agreed without emotion, but he could almost hear the unspoken tension between them. When she arrived the next day, she looked different, more composed, confident, her waitress uniform replaced by a neat blazer. She walked into his office carrying a folder. Her chin lifted, her eyes steady. He stood awkwardly for a second before saying, "You look well." She smiled faintly. "Success looks better when it's earned, I suppose." He nodded. "I deserved that." She handed him the folder. "Let's talk business." For the next half hour she spoke, clearly explaining her catering plans, sustainability options, and projected profits. He listened silently, admiring her determination. At one point, he said softly, "You've built this in weeks." She replied, "I've been building this in my head for years. I just needed someone to remind me I could." He looked at her, puzzled. "And who reminded you?" She smiled without hesitation. "You did, in the worst way possible." Her honesty hit him harder than any insult could. He leaned forward and said quietly, "Mia, I owe you an apology." She stopped him, shaking her head. "No, you don't owe me words. You owe the next person you talk down to respect." He looked at her for a long time before nodding slowly. "You'll get that." By the end of the meeting, they signed the deal, not as waitress and businessman, but as equals. As she stood to leave, he said quietly, "You paid my bill once now. Let me repay the lesson." She turned to him with a soft smile. "You already have. You listened." Months later, the partnership between Apex Holdings and Mia's Table had become one of the most talked about collaborations in the city. Her small company expanded faster than anyone expected, landing contracts with hotels and corporate events across the country. Ethan often attended those events, quietly watching her work. Her staff respected her, her clients adored her. She led with calm authority, the same grace she'd once shown carrying a tray through crowded tables. At one charity banquet, he approached her backstage while she coordinated a team of young servers. She turned surprised but composed. "Mr. Cole here to check on the catering." He smiled softly. "No, here to check on the person who taught me something I couldn't learn in any boardroom." She tilted her head, amused. "And what's that?" he said simply. "That real worth isn't measured by what you own, but by how you treat people." Her expression softened slightly. "You've changed," she said. He nodded. "You made sure of it." They both laughed quietly, the awkward tension that once divided them, replaced by something like understanding. When the event ended, the audience applauded the success of the night. Reporters rushed to interview the woman behind the catering miracle. One of them asked her, "How did Mia's Table begin?" She smiled at the crowd. "It began with a mistake, a cup of spilled coffee and a lesson in dignity. Sometimes life gives you critics to remind you of your strength. Sometimes kindness is the loudest revenge." The audience applauded. Ethan, watching from the crowd, felt something unfamiliar, pride mixed with humility. After the event, she found him waiting near the exit. He said softly, "You paid my bill that day," and walked out. She smiled. "I paid for the coffee, not for your lesson." He laughed. "Maybe." Both. She smiled faintly. "Maybe both." Then she extended her hand. "You taught me to stand taller than the insult." He took it, shaking gently. "You taught me to see lower than my pride." They stood quietly under the streetlights, the city alive around them, but their silence calm and full of peace. The same silence that had once hurt now felt whole. The same two people who had started with arrogance and apology had ended in mutual respect. proof that the smallest act of grace can turn into the biggest change. If this story made you smile, share it with someone who needs a reminder that accidents can turn into beautiful beginnings.